So we're finishing earlier than planned anyway. There was a mistake on the schedule. So I think this was meant to happen for 2 hours. I'm not going to keep you here for 2 hours, right? It's going to be short and sweet. And if you've got any questions, we would certainly like to cover them, but please keep them very poignant as well. So hopefully you've all enjoyed today. I'm not going to introduce everyone on the panel because most people have been introduced already, but Emma Fryer has joined us. I don't know whether you all know Emma. There's a few nods here and there. Emma, could you just tell everyone who you are, please?
Yes, I'm at the moment a partner at ERM, so we provide, well, they're the largest global pure, I can never say this at 3 in the afternoon, pure play sustainability consultancy, but before that I spent about 12 years providing a collective voice for data centres across Europe in terms of policy, best practice, public perception, compliance, that kind of thing. It was like being between a rock and a hard place.
Regulation, yeah.
Regulation.
So, hopefully you've all enjoyed today. I'm hoping that you got something from it. In terms of kind of where we find ourselves, it's clear that the demand is very huge for data center infrastructure. The finance is getting behind this, so if you are looking at funding or if you're in funding, then you need to start really demonstrating your credentials from an ESG perspective. I'm going to touch on with Emma quickly, but regulation is coming, right? And the regulation that's coming now, if you're delivering services at the top of your game, then you will be okay. But if you're not, Emma, there was a little wince there.
It depends. No. Go on.
But you really need to be aware that you know, inaction won't be tolerated.
I think that's true, yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So, and then the regulation is only going to become more stringent, and we're 7 and a bit years away from 2030, right? So when we get to 2030, things are going to get a little bit more crucial, and there's going to potentially be a lot more of an impact. So Emma, just take us through your thoughts on that for me.
So I wouldn't say regulation is coming. I would say regulation is here, and it's been here for quite a long time. The thing that is sort of catching everyone's thoughts at the moment is really the activities under the Green Deal, which is the most ambitious sustainability policy agenda we've ever seen, certainly in the life of the Commission. So that's coming from Europe, and anybody with operations in Europe is going to be affected, and that's most of us, I think. And those instruments are coming through. Some are already in place, some are still twinkle in the eye, but it's all very structured. There's a huge amount of cross-referencing between instruments, which we've not seen before, and that's the result of having executive vice presidents now within the Commission who kind of bang heads together across the DGs. So I think really significant change. What we're going to see, massive increase in the scope of regulations relating to sustainability, massive increase in the ambition in terms of what we're being asked to do, and what will be required of us is much greater transparency, much greater scrutiny of our supply chain and actually of our customer chain as well, so the whole value chain. So it's actually quite a mind shift in terms of what we've been looking at before, which has been mainly, I'd say, operational efficiency and compliance through the life cycle of the data centre.
And the UK is going to follow, right? The UK has a tendency to follow what Europe's doing from a regulation perspective.
I'd say the UK has a tendency now to imitate what Europe is doing, but add some gratuitous bells and whistles to that. So there's a sort of make it slightly different enough to create a second burden of obligation on operators. So yes, we'll be going in broadly the same direction, but the bonfire of regulations is not happening. And what I've seen is actually additional requirements being added to legislation like MEES, which is obviously our own creation, and ETS.
And organisations in the UK are starting to take this really seriously, right? So I'm going to bring Ben in now, if I can. And if Ben, can you just talk to us about the climate risk and the climate change adaptation approach for the NHS and what you're doing?
Yeah, of course. So this is the other side of the climate coin. And I think the NHS is quite unusual in that we wrap climate change adaptation and resilience into our definition of net zero. So people are much more familiar with the decarbonisation side, but there's been a couple of things that have happened over the last 12 months which have ramped up interest in this topic. So Guy's and St Thomas's on-prem data centres fell over in the 40-degree heat wave last July. There's a fascinating lessons learned report available on their website, actually, if you Google critical incident review for Guy's and St Thomas's, that really unwraps why it took several months for them to get back up and running again after an unplanned shutdown. And on top of that, there was a big push from government, mainly due to the Ukraine crisis over winter, for planning for energy outages, which the UK Climate Change Commission puts as one of the top 8 short-term climate risks that need managing in the UK, energy security, which is an existential risk for digital. So, you know, one of the key things that I'm trying to get people thinking about at the moment is how can we utilise the climate risk framing to make sure that we're running resilient digital and thus resilient health services, but as a kind of side benefit of that, ramp up interest and urgency in the decarbonisation agenda. So it's a different angle, and I think it's got a special power all of its own.
The other thing that Ben said that I think is worth mentioning is there's this co-benefit stroke synergy, right?
Yeah.
Do you want to just say a couple of words on that?
Yeah, so I guess the thing here is working out how to try and hook into other people's objective areas. So an obvious one, which I mentioned in the last panel, is this relationship in between FinOps and GreenOps in cloud management for money and carbon. But really, it's a case of how can you start to push sustainability up the pecking order objectives, even in a bit of a Trojan horse way, because in my world at the moment, we've got a black and white policy in place to say that we should be doing it, but there's very little with strong teeth, meaning that anything's happening as fast as it needs to. So I think there's a lot to be said for trying to think about what would normally be higher profile objectives around things like cyber security, accessibility, anything that's got really kind of firm legislative requirements around it, and see where there are sweet spots to be had between the two agendas. And push for those open doors.
And then Ed, talk us through, in terms of the design, if you're designing a data centre now and you're looking at side of the climate risk attached to it, the temperatures at 40 degrees, need to be zero carbon, what should you be doing that you're potentially not doing? And how can we really get things moving over the course of the next couple of years?
That's actually fascinating, because of the increase in temperatures that we're seeing. And you mentioned that incident, but it wasn't the only incident, probably the most significant, but not the only one. So organisations now are looking at, I'm talking in the UK here, but also I'm thinking broadly Western Europe, are now looking at increasing the amount of cooling capacity that they have available to avoid that kind of outage. Now the problem that we have right now is, if you want to offset that, in other words, you want to offset the additional carbon that you're adding by increasing your cooling capacity, you need to raise operating temperatures within the data center. And that is a bit of a problem, because many organizations are still hamstrung by service level agreements that require data center operators to operate at a much lower level than they otherwise could. And we all know, I mean, actually the Singapore government has recently published a standard, can't remember the details of it, but where they've run their own data, they've done their own tests, and are looking to increase outside of the ASHRAE envelope. But what I'm saying to you here is that we're at this point, and I think it's, I wasn't sure before we started the panel, but we were talking about, how quickly are we moving? Ben just mentioned it really. I think that things are not moving as fast as we need them to. We all know that we've got a problem in terms of forget regulation for a minute, and we just look at.
I know we've got a problem.
We've got a problem. We're not moving anywhere near fast enough.
Yeah. So.
Can I just make a
in 1 second? Just hold on. Yeah. I'm coming to you. Mary and Tina, can you just take us through what your thoughts are in terms of because NTT have got a commitment to being, by 2030, 90%?
Sure. So, thanks for this question. Indeed, we have a net zero commitment. Right now, it has been validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative. That means that we are really looking at this. We are very serious about this commitment. So by 2030, we are looking at reducing our scope 1 and 2 emissions, so operational emissions, from using a base year of 21 by 90%. And by 2040, we're looking at reducing scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, so operational and value chain emissions, 90%. So that is the level of the endeavor and the challenge.
Do you know how you're going to do it, and is that realistic?
So the big challenge of such a commitment really is the time horizon of it. The fact that it is so far in the future, and there's always questions that, okay, like, is there, do we need to do it now? Can we do it? So the fact that we talked about the cost of inaction, which is really, really important, and the fact that right now, designing a roadmap that is going to be very, very detailed about how it is going to be achieved by 2040, even if someone has all the experts and all the buy-in and all of that, we cannot do that, right? Because there is so much that is going to change between now and 2040. We can have a plan. We have a plan by how we're going to get there for the next 5 years up to 2030. But after that, there is a role of innovation, there is a role of regulation, and so much more.
But if you look at the assets that you're building now, those assets are going to be alive and kicking in 2030, 2040.
Yes.
So presumably that's driving your entire data center design, construction, everything that you're doing as a business is going to have to change to meet that target.
Yeah, we are very much aware of that. That is in line, that exactly is a part of how a roadmap needs to bring everything together. And we talked a lot about power. It's not just power, though. It's also about efficiency. As you rightly say, it is also the role of design as well when it comes to embodied carbon. So it really is about having a very firm and clear plan about all of those things. Now, do we have that 100% now? No, we don't. But we are committed. We are working on it. We are learning, and we're going to learn along the way. As long as we are consistent about the way that we're going to do that, and we have a business case that, again, is a live business case. It's not something that's going to be set in stone for now up until 2040, because it's just not going to work like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also we have the support from our leadership, because these kind of changes cannot just...
It has to come from a board level.
Exactly.
So, John, you speak to a lot of data centers, right? And you do this full time, right? So take us through your thoughts on how can Mariantina and other data centers get to this point by 2030 stroke 2040? Top 3 things that they need to do.
Right, so first thing is to start with a blank piece of paper, because the way that we do things now, which hasn't really changed in 50 odd years, needs to change. Because we're not going to address the climate emergency by doing the same thing.
And do you see people being open to doing that? Are they changing?
No, not at all. No. They just want to keep doing what they've always done. You can see that, I look at LinkedIn on a daily basis and I see announcements of data centers being built globally, and I just look at it and my heart falls. It goes, all right, so we're going to use a steel superstructure and a concrete base, and we're going to have all of this power, and then we're not going to be doing it. The utilizations of the footprint, the capacity is always going to be stranded in the future. We need to think differently. We need, as I said, blank piece of paper. I mean, for instance, if we look at the powertrain from power station to chip, does anybody know what the loss is between a kilowatt generated at a power station and how much energy gets to the chip? Does anybody know?
97%.
0.5%. Right?
That
That is horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. And why is it 0.5%? Because we transform it going up along the high trends, and then transform it coming down, and we transform it in, and the power turns up at the server, 200 volts AC, the 2 greatest heat sources in the server, power supply and chip, right? And the chip of the power supply is going from 240 volts AC to 12, plus or minus 12 volts DC.
Okay, John. So what we're going to task you with is we're going to task you with getting a blank piece of paper and drawing this out, right? Have you drawn it out?
Yes?
Okay.
I'm not going to share it with.
Not right this minute,
No,
but
right.
I think that's
But-
the sort of thing
yeah.
that we need to do, right? Because
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing is, right, if you reduce your cooling or your heat by 50%, then that impacts on what you need to cool, right? And that could even be obliterated by the fact of the new chipsets that are coming in. Graphene chips, no heat.
okay, so we've looked at a few different other things. We looked at things like IT circularity, changing the design paradigm. So instead of designing for obsolescence, we're designing for, for circularity, which is something that we haven't done. We've looked at the kind of immersion direct-to-chip cooling, how that's going to change things moving forward. One of the comments that I wanted to share with you that I was talking to someone about yesterday evening is the AI workload. So we had a conversation about AI workloads, and ChatGPT has got, I don't know, 100 million users in 2 months or something along those lines. I was talking to someone from Facebook or Meta, and they implied that their AI workload could be 7.5 gigawatts of power based on the equivalent take-up from ChatGPT. And then I was talking to someone else who's in the Bitcoin mining business, using ASICs chips. And we were talking about how Bitcoin mining started out on PCs, and then as it became more complicated, they built specialist machines to do it. And Bitmain, who are one of the main producers of Bitcoin mining machines, are starting to produce AI-based chipsets. And using an ASICs chip for AI could well be something that could reduce the power consumption, because they are more efficient. They operate at tier 1 as opposed to tier 3 standards. So I think there's going to be a convergence between this, lower tier mining environment and this higher tier data center environment. So that was just a thought process. Right, I'm going to go to the room and we're going to ask a few questions, and then we're going to give everyone a clap and go and have a drink. Yeah. So have we got any questions? Has anyone come up with a question today from listening to the panel that you would like us to ask? Aha. So we're going to go in order.
My question about the server dematerialization. What you think about the impact on software level when we can shift from 200 racks to 2 racks?
Would you like me to repeat that?
Yeah.
So I think what David's saying is that the software is very inefficient, right? So the programming side of things is pretty inefficient. These server racks are storing applications which are running. There's no regulation or control over how software is developed or programmed or anything like that. Are we seeing any regulations coming, Emma, on IT consumption from a software development perspective, or how are we going to say? Do you think there's going to be any regulations on consumer behaviour in terms of data consumption and how we consume, £56 for X terabyte from Google? What's going to happen at the demand side?
I think the consumer's never wrong in terms of the regulator. So the regulator will tend to regulate the supply, not the consumption, you see what I mean? So they will regulate the provider. And John, feel free to chip in, because I'm sure that in terms of software, that's always, from a regulatory perspective, been in the too tricky box. And the best developments I've seen there have all been voluntary. So I think I'm not seeing anything at all I certainly haven't seen any regulations targeted specifically at software efficiency, but I have been monitoring what's going on within the industry, where I think we're doing better on a voluntary basis. But it looks like John's got something to correct me on.
So there are 2 ISO 30134 metrics, dash 4 and 5, which is IT energy efficiency and IT energy utilisation. They are included in the Energy Efficiency Directive. There has been a massive pushback from the community, especially the co-location community, because they're saying, well, how can we measure that?
Is this the application of sleep states?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
The other thing, that is a piece that is still under discussion, consultancy. Let's see how that pans out. But there has been, very recently, the Green Software Foundation has released the SCI metric, which is looking at how they can reduce the coding aspect of what it's doing. And to me, that's an education piece, right? So that's wherever you learn coding from, whether you do it at home or whether you do it formally in classrooms or colleges, universities, that needs to be implemented. Right? You know, I think I look at the amount of code needed for the moon mission, right? And they were restricted on the code they could use because of the components they had at the time. But they actually had a form of virtualization on the moon mission in 1969. And they were constrained with code because of the amount of memory they could hold. As each iteration of memory's gone up, we have become bloated in terms of the amount of software we're using. So that needs to be addressed, right? So we need to think that there is a limit to how much code you can put in.
So,
And
so Ben, you've got this task in the NHS, right? I'm assuming the NHS have got a few software applications. Thousands maybe, or?
I don't know the number, but yeah.
Is anything, have you got any excuse the pun, any programs to kind of educate or to kind of have more efficient software systems or?
A few quick points, yeah. So we've got a low carbon digital service design checklist that includes stuff around that. It's fairly high level, just to kind of get people in through the door into thinking about it. We're also working with some suppliers that are fairly new to the marketplace that are running software carbon assessments. I won't name their name, but happy to share that with anyone after if they want to. So, and I did have one more bit, but it's gone out of my head. Oh yeah, and the other bit is quite a tangible example is NHS England. They've relaunched the desktop that we all have on our computers, and just to a lighter weight version, not all the way to thin client, but a lighter weight version, which is running much lower energy. But I think more importantly, given the whole embodied carbon piece that's been a big part of the agenda today, they reckon that they'll probably be able to at least double the replacement cycle on the kit, which is, you know, a halving of embodied energy per year, just like that.
And that's part of the problem with the kit, isn't it? Because as they upgrade the software,
Yeah.
you have to upgrade the hardware, right? So they're intertwined in terms of the reliance on.
but a thin client is effectively a dumb terminal, so all
Yeah,
of that
so
is
it's,
done at the server end.
But I mean, in general, part of the challenge with keeping the same hardware is the requirements from a software perspective.
It's something we haven't even covered today, which is the e-waste mountain that's being developed and causing environmental degradation in places like East Africa and China through people trying to recycle the stuff. And
Okay.
that's not something we've covered.
So have we got any other questions? I did see some hands. Oh,
Hello. Hi, this is Lee from Texas, US. We are a renewable energy providers. So I keep hearing people say they have a goal, either hit for scope 3 emission, and everybody's concerned if they can hit goals. So my question is, what prevent you from achieving those goals, and also what kind of green energy providers you guys are looking for?
Well, renewable energy is scope 2. On scope 3, it's more of the electromechanical and all of the other upstream components that we are using, which includes ICT equipment. And I do think the ICT companies need to step up in decarbonising their products. And for instance, if you look at Dell and look at their EPD or their carbon footprint for one of their servers, the vast majority of it is actually in the manufacturing, and they assume, I think it's 8 hours a day for 4 years in operation, and that's minuscule compared to the embodied manufacturing carbon. So they need to start thinking about how they're going to shrink and decarbonise their own operations. And bearing in mind, they're also mostly manufactured in Taiwan and China, so they're using dirty coal to begin with.
I think part of the challenge is understanding what the number is in the first place, right? Being able to get accurate data across the board that is benchmarkable and allows you to, know where you currently are and how you can move in that direction, that's all tied up in the challenge.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that in order to get an EPD, you need to have a product category, and there isn't a data center product category, so we're actually being assessed under other product categories which may not be data center related. I do understand the French Data Center Association did approach EPD International and see if they could create a data center specific CPR, and that is
Well, we have a French man with a question here, so I'm going to...
Okay, thank you, Dan. In fact, I have two questions. First one for regulation. I will ask two questions, and then first one about regulations. Starlink incoming underway. Starlink, you know Starlink, Elon Musk, which means that anybody will be able to connect to Starlink and get all the processing done somewhere else than in the country, which means how will you make sure that those guys respect regulations that you want to apply here for other providers? That means that not the consumers that you are not forcing to follow rules will not move away to go somewhere else. That's the first question. Second, maybe somebody knows here, you know that Microsoft is pushing for Office 365, and you were talking about software. Isn't better to have finally Office on your desktop working in and have synchronization later on, rather than being continuously connecting to the server? So isn't something that, and maybe a question for NHS, something that you want to do to make sure that you reduce your consumptions? That's three questions.
Okay, did we get that? Starlink, you know Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite network that's going to be, so if there is if workload is being done outside of the territory, how are you going to hold people accountable from a regulatory perspective, depending on where a piece of work is being done? I'm assuming
I think it's where you make profits. So my understanding, and John, if for some of it, so something like CSRD, it's how much profit you make in a region, not where that service is delivered. That my understanding. So if you make money out of a region, particularly EU, then you are regulated by the EU under CSRD. That is my understanding. I think it's $150 million, is it? Is that the threshold? Sorry?
Well, never mind.
Well,
So-
I can tell you about the taxonomy. So if you for instance, we're working with a UK investment trust that's got European investors, and they're building a data center in Texas, and they are required to report under TCDA2 for their Texas facility. And I think it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, and I think, you know, that there's a lot of data moving around the world across various different networks, you know, and it's very difficult to understand what the carbon impact is of data flow. Where a workload is being done, ultimately it comes down to the power consumption of the asset, right? That's how you're calculating.
I'm not sure whether how Tesla's satellites are powered, but I suspect they're powered by renewable energy. So they've probably got some solar panels pointing towards the sun. So effectively, I don't know how you can't account for that within earthbound legislation.
He's got batteries up there. He's got like.
Well, he must be getting
Lithium
solar as
ion.
well. So I would imagine that, you know, how do you account
No, I
for
get
the
it, I get it.
sun's energy?
And then Ben, the other question for you was, if you're using an ASP, so if you're using a remote desktop, do you take into consideration the data transfer and like the end-to-end application carbon consumption over and above just what's happening at a desktop level?
Well, yeah, you should do. Just for clarity, we don't have properly remote desktops, but just a lighter weight solution. But yeah, I mean, there are some numbers in that book I quoted earlier, How Bad Are Bananas, the carbon footprint of everything. Do a little bit of analysis on this, the question that you asked, actually. So you could have a look there for the figures, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. But intuitively, it should be better. You've got good energy sourcing from Microsoft, if you believe all of the material on their web pages. You've got single versions of documents, like emailing big documents around to lots of people is, you know, intuitively a bad thing. And then you've got all the virtualization, obviously, as well, from the cloud solutions. For the behavioural challenges around enforcement. So if you're giving people another way of doing it as well, then it's culturally quite a big, difficult thing to change across to. So it's about whether you just in one fell swoop move to a new system like that.
Okay.
I think what's interesting is we've heard a lot today about Science-Based Targets Initiative and people linking with that. Well, actually, I actually think that that particular scheme, which is actually based on the old GHG protocol for ICT, is actually watered down from the GHG protocol, which was released in 2017, which did have a number of chapters, which did go into really fine detail of how you calculate the carbon and energy emissions for each of the telecom sectors and compute sectors and cloud sectors. The science-based targets is very heavily watered down compared to that. We're working with clients and we use the GHG protocol ICT guidance from 2017 because it's the best we've found.
Yeah, you should be using the most granular
Absolutely.
approach that you possibly can. So, closing thoughts from our esteemed panelists. Emma,
Sorry.
just
Before we close, I just want to ask a question myself about the role of offsetting, because you also have it on,
Oh, yeah.
and a discussion about net zero wouldn't be complete without talking about the role of offsets, really. So,
so do you want me to answer that?
you, but the panel
No,
in
I was
general.
going to say, I mean, I
Yeah.
think the reason I put it up there to be provocative, right?
Right.
Because in reality, you know, you're not going to get to net zero unless there is some form of offsetting, right? It's impossible to get to zero carbon because there's carbon in everything that we do, right? So there's going to have to
Yes.
be some form of investment in, you know, either whatever it might be to compensate for the stuff that you can't, the carbon that you can't reduce.
Yes. Actually, the role of offsetting in a net zero commitment is a little bit more specific in the sense that it's not just about compensation. It is actually about removal. And in that sense, there is very specific projects that are applicable when it comes to the role that they can play in a net zero, because there is that many projects out there right now when it comes to offsetting that, as you say, are on the compensation side. Removal, which is actually projects that are having an impact of actively removing carbon from the atmosphere, is a bit of a different conversation.
So you mean carbon sequestration in terms of,
When we talk about nature-based solutions, but also carbon storage and removal when it comes to technology-based solutions, which right now their costs are very, very high.
so if that cost came down, that's something that you would invest more in, presumably, as a business.
It's something
as
that
part of-
organizations with a net zero commitment such as ourselves, we need to explore. And we definitely need to have more conversations.
How
around this area.
viable is that? How do you think that will get more viable over the course of the next 5 years?
It doesn't matter what I think. What matters is that that is really what is part of the global plan, right? That's the
Yeah,
fact that we
okay.
cannot get to zero because there's so many constraints. But what we can actually do is invest in projects that, or by the equivalent of credits that are about actively removing carbon from the atmosphere. So that's an area that we would need to.
I think unless your offsetting scheme is actually supported by the UN carbon delivery mechanism, then it's probably a scam, and I think that it is actually going to be a big bag of worms in the future. All offsetting schemes have got suspicions around them. You cannot just plant some trees and think that that's going to be sufficient enough. We've actually been looking at two interesting ones, and these are a bit left field, so bear with me on this. So one of them is kelp farms, actually production of kelp, seaweed, which is quite interesting. And the other one, which is actually linked in with the lobster fishery use of waste heat in Stavanger, and that is actually whale breeding, because whales can store carbon in their bones for a considerable amount of time, and then as they drop to the seafloor, it's basically secured on the seabed for some time. So that is interesting. If we had a whale breeding program, we could technically meet a lot of our, well, at least a proportion of the carbon offset. It's eaten by the fish, but the actual bone itself is where the carbon's locked in.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so, Ian?
You learn something new every day.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, you know, if they, if the fish become within British waters, apparently they become British fish. But you know, It's an absolute customs thing. To be honest, the thing is,
Okay,
we need to look at it from a global perspective, and that needs to be a global initiative, right? Maybe we shouldn't have gone and killed all the whales back in the 18 and 1900s.
So let's just do some last closing thoughts. We'll start with Emma, please.
So I'm going to pick up the Scope 3 question, and I imagine that's been discussed deeply today. But Scope 3 isn't just about your supply chain, it's also about your customer chain. It's your whole value chain. So for data centres and cloud service providers, your Scope 3 is going to vary dramatically on where you sit within the stack. So for a data centre provider, Scope 2 is likely to dominate to a significant extent. Once you're, say, a software provider, then Scope 3 is going to be hugely dominant. And if you're a software provider hosted by a cloud service provider in a co-location data centre, then your Scope 3 is going to probably be well over 99% of your overall emissions. And I think that's one of the things that is forgotten. And actually reducing that is very tricky for those people. So that would be my parting thought.
Don't have any control over it, really.
And also contractual arrangements within those data centre environments are very important in getting that right, because they need to, they need to be, essentially your reporting will have to reflect those contractual arrangements in hosted environments.
Yeah, I think Lauren's got a couple of interesting comments on Scope 3 that he can share with you on after this, maybe. Marianetta?
Valentina.
Valentina, I'm sorry.
No worries.
It's been a long day.
Indeed. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with them about the big challenge and complications around Scope 3 emissions. And from our point of view, something that I would like to highlight as a closing remark is the role of engagement and collaboration, in the sense that no organization can do net zero on their own. We need to work more closely with our partners throughout our value chains, from our suppliers to our clients as well. And also, we need to embrace regulatory regulations as a driver, and also be mindful of questions and pressure from other external stakeholders as well, such as investors and even more broadly the broader public audience out there. So that's really my main sort of highlight, the role of collaboration and working together in an ecosystem in order to achieve net zero. Thank you.
Edward?
I, controversially for some time, have been a big supporter of regulation when many people said, no, this industry can self-regulate. I've never believed we can self-regulate. I'm equally cautious about regulation and what that means. But I really do think that it's only with that and growing public pressure that we will see meaningful change, because the industry itself, the industry at least that we live in, is paralysed. Okay, it cannot do very much because it's hamstrung by service level agreements, downward cost pressure, and I must say, sustainability is still, whatever people say, is still relatively low on their agenda. It's all about cost and performance metrics when it comes to certainly the private sector.
Don't you find that hypocritical, though, given the fact that the customers are the ones that have got the, like Microsoft, for instance?
Listen, I'm not going to call out names. I would just simply say, do I find it
Well,
hypocritical?
Microsoft-
I find it appalling. I find it absolutely appalling. The number of times that we've gone to, to a co-location company and then said, right, look, we'll do demand response. We can change the narrative here in terms of your carbon emissions. Scope 3 is one thing, and you can control that to some degree, and you could measure it to a degree. But demand response can change. You change your carbon profile further up the chain. Very few people are talking about it. You take that to the ultimate client. Not necessarily the people you were talking about, but the ultimate clients, the cloud service providers, and I'm not seeing any shift yet. Microsoft were the first to change, and they did in Ireland. They've started to participate. I honestly believe governments must mandate data centers to participate in demand response, because that is, I would write in the paper at the moment, so I can't give you the numbers yet. But it will make a huge difference to the amount of carbon that an organisation is participating if they've got a high IT workload.
Okay, Ben?
Okay, I think my challenge would be to zoom out and take a bit of a bigger systems view. So digital infrastructure enables digital services which go on to provide some kind of function to society. That function may create a sustainability benefit or a further sustainability cost, but what's the kind of net impact of that whole chain of stuff? That's the view we take within my work within the NHS, a kind of net gain carbon angle, where the assumption being that generally speaking digital health services will create a carbon saving versus the old version. And then taking that one step further, you know, I'm not a big believer in the sustainability challenge being a personal responsibility, but if we could start to push out some information to digital service users about what's the impact of their digital choices, perhaps that's another thing that could start to make a bit of change.
And John?
Education, 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 right? I think if you look at, everybody is on the sustainability journey in every single sector, every single country, well, most countries, every single sector. There is a lack of suitably skilled sustainability professionals in order to provide advice to every sector and every industry. But we in the data center community are probably the most advanced of everybody. But we still
That's
have
really scary, isn't it?
well, we still have to have a massive education piece. We need to educate customers about temperatures. We need to educate customers and change their perception of business models. You know, I was talking to somebody earlier and saying...
It was a quick last
It's very quick, yeah. So one of the largest colo providers went to 24 degrees, right, for their SLAs. And apparently they lost a few customers who were not happy about going to 24 degrees. And I was just saying, you know, okay, so they've moved. It's cost them a lot of money to move because the migration costs of shifting from one colo to another are huge. And yet that co-location company they've just moved to will probably go to 24 degrees in 2 years, right? So it's a complete waste of time. Education, education, education. We have to talk to our customers. We have to educate them about real life facts of data center engineering and how we're going to address our climate goals.
I think we
It's as
need to
simple as
put that
that.
on another piece of paper.
Yeah.
We've got 2 pieces of paper
Actually,
coming out
Dan,
of this.
you know, you should look at some of the work that I've already done for you,
No, I'm
which
joking,
is on the
I'm joking.
videos on your website.
So I would say education, but action as well.
Education and action, yes, definitely.
So everyone, thank you so much for coming to our event today. Thank you, panellists.